Weeks before his death, Pope Francis visited Buckingham Palace and spoke quietly to a royal guard. Just one sentence, never shared with the press. So what were those last words of his? And why has that moment stayed with the guard ever since? Before we reveal it, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The courtyard at Buckingham Palace held its breath that winter morning. Frost clung stubbornly to the wrought iron gates, delicate as lace, while the pale January sun stretched skeletal shadows across ancient stones. A line of Queen's guards stood immobile as statues, their scarlet tunics shocking against London's perpetual grey. Among them, Corporal James Ashford hadn't blinked in 22 minutes. His eyes burned, but his face revealed nothing. Stationed near the northwest entrance, directly opposite the walkway that curved from courtyard to reception hall, Ashford embodied everything the guard represented. 38 years old, with shoulders shaped by discipline and a spine that knew the cost of slouching. 2 tours in Helmand had taught him what movement could cost. In war, hesitation kills. In ceremony, it dishonours. The bearskin cap sat heavily on his head, a familiar weight after 14 years of service. The motorcade's arrival was deliberately understated. 3 black vehicles, minimal security, no fanfare. A papal visit to Buckingham Palace was rare enough. The last had been over a decade earlier, but this one was different. Pope Francis had requested this stop personally. A brief moment with the guards, the Vatican aide had explained. Nothing official, they'd said. His Holiness simply wants to see the men who stand in stillness. The lead vehicle slowed to a stop at exactly 10:04 a.m. Through his peripheral vision, the only movement allowed a guard on duty, Ashford caught the flutter of white as the Pope emerged. Francis moved more slowly than he appeared on television. His shoulders hunched slightly against the British chill, his cassock rippling in the breeze. He paused, taking in the courtyard with quiet reverence before beginning his approach toward the palace steps. Ashford remained perfectly motionless. Eyes front, mind compartmentalized. Dignitary on approach, standard protocol. No deviation. And then it happened. Francis had reached the midpoint between gates and steps when his foot caught on an uneven cobblestone, one of those ancient imperfections that had somehow escaped the groundskeeper's notice that morning. The stumble was subtle but unmistakable. His balance shifted, white-clad arms reflexively reaching outward for something, anything, to prevent what gravity had already decided. Ashford moved. No calculation. No weighing of consequences. His body reacted in the space between heartbeats. One boot forward, halberd twisted aside with practiced hands, breaking rank with a fluid precision that betrayed his military training. His gloved hand found the Pope's elbow a heartbeat before disaster, steadying him with the gentlest pressure, just enough. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but in that moment, Ashford shattered centuries of tradition. A royal guard does not move. The courtyard froze. Cameras stopped clicking. Aides and diplomats exchanged stunned glances, witnessing what appeared to be protocol collapsing in real time. Francis steadied himself, blinked twice, then turned to meet the eyes of the man who'd broken ranks to help him. Lines deepened around the Pope's eyes as he smiled. A warmth that somehow cut through London's perpetual damp. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice soft but clear as cathedral bells. Ashford returned to position immediately. Back straight, eyes forward, face impassive, as though nothing had happened. But everything had. They came for him 15 minutes later. Not immediately. That would have drawn too much attention, created a scene, so Ashford stood in place, feeling the courtyard's silence press against him like a physical weight. No one spoke. No one looked his way. But he felt the inevitable approaching, like a soldier feels the whisper of incoming artillery before impact. "Ashford! Inside! Now!" Sergeant Alcott's voice was terse, brooking no argument. Protocol dictated that royal guards remain at their post until formally relieved by another guardsman. But this was no ordinary day. Ashford executed a crisp about-turn and followed Alcott through the inner courtyard doors, his boots echoing against polished marble like distant gunfire. Palace staff averted their eyes as he passed, a man marked by his own decision. The administrative chamber they led him to was small, its windows facing an inner garden rarely seen by the public. Lieutenant Mercer waited inside, ramrod straight and tight-lipped, alongside a civilian whose Vatican credentials hung from a lanyard around his neck. "Corporal," Mercer began, voice clipped but not hostile, "you're not in trouble. Not yet. But what happened out there?" "Was instinct, sir," Ashford interrupted calmly, gaze fixed on the wall behind his superior. A flicker of something, not quite annoyance, not quite respect, crossed Mercer's face. The Vatican official stepped forward, a slight man with careful eyes and hands that moved deliberately, as if weighing invisible objects. "His Holiness was not injured," he said in lightly accented English. "Quite the opposite. He asked me to convey his personal thanks, but more than that." A pause, weighted with significance. "He would like to speak with you, privately, now." Ashford felt a moment of genuine surprise, the first real emotion to penetrate his professional veneer since the incident. "Now, sir?" The aide nodded once. "He specifically requested it before the next round of formal proceedings." Mercer looked distinctly uncomfortable, like a man forced to deviate from a carefully arranged script. "He broke protocol once. I'm not convinced letting him out of sight is—" "This request comes directly from Pope Francis," the aide interrupted with quiet authority. "If there are questions later, I'll take full responsibility." Silence stretched between them like an over-tightened wire. Finally, Mercer exhaled sharply through his nose and nodded toward Ashford. "Dismissed. For this purpose only. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Ashford gave a formal nod and followed the Vatican aide through corridors he'd rarely seen despite years of service. They passed through a small side chapel with stained glass that cast jewelled light across the floor, down a narrow stairwell, then emerged into what appeared to be a private sitting room, one of several temporary quarters arranged for distinguished visitors. The door opened, and there he was. Pope Francis sat alone by a window, coat removed, white sleeves rolled slightly to reveal thin wrists mapped with blue veins. A tray with untouched tea sat beside him. In person, away from cameras and crowds, he looked smaller somehow, not diminished, but distilled. Every line in his face seemed earned rather than imposed, as if each had been carved by specific moments of compassion or hardship. "Corporal," he said gently, his voice carrying the slight rasp of age. "Please, come in. Sit." Ashford hesitated at the threshold. All his training had prepared him for formality, for structure, but this intimate space, this unexpected invitation, left him momentarily adrift. He remained standing. Francis smiled, the skin around his eyes crinkling. "Or stand, if you prefer. You're a man of habit. I understand this." The small room fell silent except for the distant ticking of a mantel clock. "I imagine you're expecting either punishment or praise," Francis continued, studying Ashford with eyes that seemed to see beyond the uniform. "But I have no intention of offering either. Just a question." Ashford waited, at attention even without meaning to be. "What stopped you from waiting?" Francis asked simply. "What made you move when others would have let me fall?" The question caught Ashford off guard, not because it was accusatory, but because it laid bare the very thing he hadn't yet examined himself. "I don't know, Your Holiness," he answered with unexpected honesty. "I just moved." Francis leaned back, satisfaction softening his expression. That's exactly why I wanted to speak with you. Ashford stood in the same posture he maintained on parade, shoulders squared, hands clasped behind his back, feet planted shoulder-width apart. But with each passing moment, the strangeness of the situation became more apparent. He wasn't in formation anymore. This wasn't ceremony. This was something else entirely. Pope Francis remained seated, watching him with an expression that bordered on amusement, though not unkind. It wasn't mockery, but something closer to gentle understanding. "I've been nearly knocked over by strong winds," the Pope said conversationally, "but never by a stone. Strange, isn't it? That something so small could unbalance something that has stood for years." Ashford remained silent, uncertain whether he was meant to respond or simply listen. Training insisted on the latter. Instinct, the same instinct that had made him move, whispered otherwise. Francis gestured toward a chair near the fireplace. "Please, I insist." Reluctantly, Ashford sat, though he kept his bearskin cap firmly in place. The contradiction felt necessary, to be seated in the Pope's presence while still embodying the guard he represented. Francis took a sip from his teacup and nodded to the aide standing discreetly by the door. Without a word, the man bowed slightly and exited, leaving them completely alone. "Do you know why I asked to visit the guard today?" Francis asked, setting his cup down with a faint porcelain clink. Ashford paused. "No, Your Holiness." A soft chuckle escaped the Pope's lips. "Good, that makes two of us." Something in Ashford's expression must have shifted, not quite a smile, but perhaps the ghost of one, the closest he'd come while in uniform in years. "I told my advisers I wanted to see Buckingham Palace," Francis continued, sunlight from the window catching the silver cross at his chest. "They arranged meetings, prepared statements, coordinated with your royal family, and yes, I did all that, but in truth," he leaned forward slightly, "I wanted to see those who never speak." Ashford looked up, meeting the Pope's gaze directly for the first time. "You guards," Francis said softly, "I've watched your kind from afar for many years. I admire the silence, the discipline, but I also fear it." "Fear it, Your Holiness," Ashford repeated, genuine confusion breaking through his practiced reserve. The Pope nodded, eyes suddenly distant. "Because I know what such silence costs. It isn't free, Corporal. It consumes things, thoughts, memories, feelings. Eventually it begins to convince the keeper that standing still is the same as standing strong." Ashford felt something shift within his chest, like a lock turning without a key. The words found purchase in places he had armoured against intrusion. "When I was younger," Francis said, gaze drifting toward the window, "I believed silence was holy. That stillness was reverence. But I've learned that holiness sometimes speaks. Sometimes it reaches out a hand." He looked back at Ashford, eyes suddenly sharp with clarity. "That's what you did today. You reached out a hand." Ashford said nothing. What could he possibly add? Francis reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden crucifix. It wasn't ornate, just simple wood, unvarnished, worn smooth at the edges, as if handled daily for decades. He extended it toward Ashford. "This belonged to a soldier I knew in Buenos Aires, not a guardsman. He was my brother's friend, fought in the Falklands." Something passed across Francis's face. An old grief, perhaps. "I carry it when I travel, to remind myself what courage looks like when no one is watching." Ashford accepted the crucifix with reverent caution, his gloved fingers barely touching the worn surface. "You can't keep it," Francis added, with unexpected lightness, a glint of humour in his eyes. "I'll need it back. But today, I want you to hold it, just until I leave." Ashford nodded once, closing his fingers carefully around the small wooden cross. "Do you regret moving?" the Pope asked suddenly. "No, Your Holiness." Then why does your face say otherwise? Ashford blinked, surprised at how easily this old man could read what he thought he'd hidden. Francis sighed, a sound both weary and warm. You fear what they'll say, what they'll think. That breaking formation, breaking silence, somehow makes you less. But I tell you this, there is nothing stronger than kindness that defies rules. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't the hollow silence of ceremony. This was human silence, warm, breathing, pregnant with unspoken understanding. Finally, Francis rose, his joints protesting audibly. You may return to your duties now. Ashford stood as well, tucking the crucifix carefully inside his glove, where it pressed against his palm. But as he turned toward the door, the Pope spoke once more, his voice barely above a whisper. You didn't fail the crown today. You reminded it why it still matters. And with that, he turned toward a side door, leaving Ashford standing not merely as a guard, but as something more complex. A man caught between worlds, duty in one hand and compassion in the other. The remainder of the papal visit proceeded according to protocol, handshakes captured by photographers, formal exchanges between dignitaries, guided tours through corridors heavy with history. Pope Francis smiled for cameras, spoke cordially with members of the royal family, and shared a quiet laugh with the Archbishop of Canterbury. The press release issued that evening was appropriately bland. His Holiness visited Buckingham Palace for a diplomatic engagement, marking a moment of unity and mutual respect. No mention of a guard who broke formation, no mention of a private conversation. No record of a wooden crucifix passed between unlikely hands. But inside the palace walls, beneath the veneer of ceremony, the ripples spread outward. Ashford returned to the barracks without fanfare, his boots marking precise time against the polished floor. As he passed the recreation room, 2 junior guards abruptly fell silent. Another pretended intense interest in cleaning equipment he'd already cleaned. One nodded acknowledgement but offered no words. By nightfall, the story had taken root and sprouted whispers. Someone had seen him step from position. Someone else swore they'd witnessed the Pope speaking directly to him afterward. No one knew exactly what had transpired, but that hardly mattered. He had become legend. "Did you really touch the Pope?" a recruit whispered in the darkened locker bay, unaware that Ashford was just around the corner. "Kept him from falling flat on the stones," came the urgent reply. "Swear to God, my cousin's mate is in the diplomatic detail. Said it happened right there where everyone could see." Ashford sat alone on his bunk that night, uniform carefully hung, the room quiet except for distant footsteps in the corridor. The crucifix rested in his open palm, worn wood, warm from hours of contact. He hadn't spoken since the conversation with Francis, not to his commanding officer, not to his fellow guards, not even to the chaplain who had given him a significant look in passing that promised, "We'll discuss this later." He didn't need to speak, not yet, because some things resided beyond words. Some moments carved themselves into memory, not through explanation, but through the sheer weight of their occurrence. He carefully placed the crucifix in the inner pocket of his dress coat, the same coat he'd worn when he reached for the Pope. And as he switched off the bedside lamp, he stared into the darkness, uncertain whether the heaviness in his chest was the burden of broken protocol or something far more valuable. He didn't need the others to understand, but he knew they would never view him quite the same way again. The morning Pope Francis died, Corporal Ashford was polishing his boots. Dawn had barely broken, not quite 6. Rain lashed against the windows of Wellington Barracks, transforming the parade grounds to shimmering black glass. The television in the common room murmured quietly, its volume low enough that only headlines registered. Economic forecasts, political disputes, celebrity gossip. Background noise, easily ignored. Until it wasn't. Ashford didn't hear the announcement first. He saw it. White text crawling beneath a solemn-faced anchor. Breaking. Pope Francis dead, at 89. The polishing cloth slipped from his fingers. The room was otherwise empty, except for the soft hiss of a kettle reaching boil and the distant cadence of a drill sergeant's count filtering through stone walls. Ashford sat motionless, staring at the screen. Not from shock. He had witnessed death before, but because something vital seemed to have quietly departed from the world, leaving it measurably diminished. He rose without conscious decision, straightened his back from long habit, and walked out into the rain. By the time he reached the central courtyard, the flag above the barracks had already been lowered to half-staff, its sodden fabric hanging heavy against the pole. Several guards gathered nearby, speaking in subdued tones. One glanced up as Ashford approached, but said nothing. He stood there for long minutes, rain soaking through his civilian clothes. No umbrella? No cover. Just the storm and the silence and something unnamed pressing against his ribs from the inside. That afternoon, when he returned to his quarters, a cream-coloured envelope waited beneath his door. Heavy parchment, expensive to the touch, no postage stamp or return address, just his name, J. Ashford, written in careful, slanted script. The red wax seal bore the unmistakable insignia of the Holy See. He didn't open it immediately. The envelope remained untouched on his nightstand for hours as rain drummed against the windows and the barracks settled into evening quiet. He thought of their conversation, of the crucifix still nestled in his dress coat, of the warmth in Francis's eyes when he'd said, "You reminded it why it still matters." Finally, as darkness fell completely, Ashford lit the reading lamp and carefully broke the seal, preserving it intact as he withdrew the letter inside. The note was handwritten in the same careful hand as the envelope. No formal heading, no ornate introduction, just a simple line at the top. To the guard who didn't wait to be told. He read it once, then again more slowly. Some will say you disobeyed, but I saw the truth in your eyes that day. I saw a man who moved not out of pride but principle, who understood that sometimes the stillness we uphold can become a prison if we forget what it was built to protect. Something tightened in Ashford's chest as he continued reading. When I stumbled, the world might not have noticed had I fallen. But you did, and you acted. In that moment, you became the kind of man tradition was meant to preserve, not the kind it punishes. At the bottom, a final line was underlined once with a slightly trembling hand. Never forget, reverence without humanity is only ceremony. No signature, just Francisco. Ashford folded the letter with methodical precision and tucked it inside the same inner pocket where he kept the crucifix. He stood by the window for a long while afterward, watching rain dissolve into evening mist. Then he retrieved the wooden cross from his dress uniform, running his thumb along its worn edges before wrapping both items, letter and crucifix, in a square of clean cloth. He didn't weep, he didn't need to. But in the solitude of that moment, something crystallized within him that no training manual had ever addressed. A truth he would carry forward, unspoken but indelible. Ashford told no one about the letter. He made no mention of its contents, offered no hints of its existence. But those who knew him best noticed subtle changes, not in his discipline, which remained impeccable, but in something deeper, something less definable. He was still the most reliable man on the roster, still the first to arrive for inspection and the last to leave the firing range. His boots still reflected light like polished obsidian. His uniform still hung perfectly aligned in his locker. But something had altered behind his eyes, as if part of him now resided slightly elsewhere, not divorced from duty, but perceiving it through a wider lens. 2 weeks after the Pope's passing, a private memorial service was held at the Vatican Embassy in London. The gathering was small, perhaps 50 invited guests, mostly clergy and diplomatic personnel. Buckingham Palace offered its own quiet tribute in the form of a black velvet banner bearing the Vatican seal, draped beside the Queen's guard post at the south gate. Ashford was assigned to that gate. He hadn't requested the posting, neither had he objected when the orders came down. He simply acknowledged them and prepared accordingly. That morning, as sunlight broke through clouds for the first time in days, he stood beneath the memorial banner while tourists passed in streams. Most were unaware of its significance. Some paused for photographs. A few bowed their heads briefly. Ashford remained motionless through it all, hands wrapped precisely around his ceremonial rifle, gaze fixed on the middle distance, except once. Midway through his shift, an aide from the Vatican embassy emerged carrying something wrapped in black cloth. Without ceremony, he approached the banner and placed a small wooden crucifix at its base, identical to the one Ashford had held during his meeting with Francis. But this one bore an inscription, etched into the back in delicate gold lettering, "For the one who didn't wait to be told." The aide didn't approach Ashford directly. He simply placed the crucifix, straightened, and offered a single nod in the guard's direction before returning through the embassy gates. No words were exchanged, none were necessary. That night, alone in his quarters, Ashford unfolded the Pope's letter again. He hadn't touched it since the day it arrived. Now, in the stillness of the barracks, he let the words wash over him anew. "Some will say you disobeyed." Indeed, they had, in whispers, in sidelong glances, in the quiet reassignment that had followed. He'd been informed, not unkindly, that he would be removed from high-visibility postings for the foreseeable future. A cooling-off period, they called it. Let the story fade. Ashford hadn't protested. "But I saw the truth in your eyes." He remembered how Francis had looked at him, not with the practiced distance of dignitaries or the calculation of officers, but with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who had carried too many secrets and too few chances to share them. You moved not out of pride, but principle. And hadn't that been the truth? For years, Ashford had followed every regulation, every rotation, every expectation without question. But in that singular moment, movement had preceded thought. It wasn't rebellion, it was reflex. Humanity asserting itself before training could intervene, and for the first time in his service, someone had recognized the value in that truth. Reverence without humanity is only ceremony. The final line resonated in the quiet room. Ashford reached for the crucifix given to him that morning, with its golden inscription catching lamplight. He traced the lettering with his fingertip, feeling the slight ridge of each character. Then he opened his drawer and placed both items, letter and crucifix, inside, wrapped together in the same cloth. Not hidden, not displayed, preserved. For what purpose? He couldn't have articulated it precisely. Perhaps as a reminder that standing still could indeed be sacred, but only when that stillness didn't become blindness to what truly mattered. As he turned off the light and settled into darkness, something within his chest felt lighter, not vindicated, not absolved, just understood. And that was enough. Winter lingered that year, reluctant to surrender to spring. The Queen's Guard rotated through ceremonies with clockwork precision, scarlet tunics standing out against the eternal grey of London stone. Corporal Ashford had returned to routine duty, though never again to the prominent front gates. His new assignments were quieter: inner court rotations, specialised security details, historical site inspections. None of it troubled him, until the request arrived. A formal tribute was being organised at Westminster Cathedral, a symbolic farewell to Pope Francis from the United Kingdom. Not political, not televised, simply reverent. The Guard was asked to provide ceremonial presence at the cathedral doors as dignitaries arrived. Ashford's name appeared on the roster. He said nothing, acknowledged the assignment, reported exactly 17 minutes early. His uniform that morning was flawless, buttons catching light like coins tossed into cathedral wells, boots reflecting clouds, and tucked within his inner breast pocket, beneath layers of wool and brass, rested the crucifix. The great doors of Westminster Cathedral stood open to spring air, allowing light to spill across marble floors still cool from night. Inside, a choir practiced ancient Latin hymns that seemed to hover in the space between columns. Outside, morning sun warmed the steps where the guards had been positioned, not in formation, but as individual sentinels spaced evenly apart. As final preparations were completed, Ashford made a decision. He stepped slightly off position, not far, just enough to approach the base of the main arch where a draped Vatican banner trembled in the breeze. Without explanation, he knelt briefly and placed the crucifix at the foot of the steps, directly beneath the banner, in a location cameras wouldn't capture, but where every passing eye would follow. Then he returned to his post. A chaplain standing nearby observed in silence, said nothing. A senior officer noted the movement from a distance. Neither frowned nor signalled, simply met Ashford's gaze with the slightest nod. Acknowledgement passed between men who understood that some things transcended rulebooks. The ceremony proceeded without interruption. Ambassadors spoke measured words of tribute. Bishops intoned ancient prayers. Choirs lifted voices in harmony that seemed to push against the cathedral's stone limits. At the ceremony's conclusion, as guests filed out in solemn procession, a familiar figure in clerical robes paused at the cathedral entrance. It was the Vatican aide who had delivered the letter. He bent down, lifted the crucifix with reverent hands, and whispered words too soft for anyone else to hear. Then he looked up, met Ashford's unwavering gaze, and offered a smile tinged with both sadness and recognition. A smile that said, without words, he would have appreciated this. Ashford maintained his position. Perfect stillness, perfect focus. But the stillness he embodied now wasn't mere obedience to protocol. It was honour in its truest form. Would you have moved in that moment if you were standing in Corporal Ashford's boots? Do you believe tradition should be upheld at all costs? Or should compassion take precedence when the two collide? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story moved you, make sure to like, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our next upload. We share powerful Royal Guard stories daily, and tomorrow's tale will leave you just as speechless. Share this video with someone who believes true honour isn't always found in stillness, but sometimes in the courage to move when everything says, stand fast. Our other unforgettable stories are now appearing on your screen. Choose one to watch next, and we'll see you tomorrow with another story that might just change how you see these silent guardians of tradition.